If you're going to launch a vaccination campaign, wouldn't you like to know in advance how anti-vaxxers will respond? You'll want to hear the results of some research conducted by a UK communications agency in the FIR interview coming your way right now.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this For Immediate Release Interviews podcast. I'm Neville Hobson in the UK.
And this is Shel Holtz in the US, and we have with us Ben Myall from 3 Whiskey, a marketing agency headquartered in the UK. How are you, Ben?
I'm really well, and thanks for having me. It's great to be invited onto the show.
We're very happy to have you here. We're here to talk about some research that your agency did in relation to scientific-based organizations, pharmaceutical companies that are behind the COVID vaccines, talking about those on social media, the impact they can have. And this is research that was done a while ago, so we'll talk about how that research has shaken out and the advice that you offered. We'll cover that off and then see whether people followed it and how it worked. But first, I have to ask you about your agency called 3 Whiskey. Can you tell us about the agency in general, what you folks do, a little bit about your background, and I'm dying to know how the name of the agency came to be.
Absolutely. That's a very common question about 3 Whiskey. So let me jump in.
I'm not surprised at all.
Let me jump in a little bit with some of my background. I started my career in publishing. I, in fact, used to sell classified ads for Exchange and Mark many years ago. That's how I got started in the world of media. It wasn't particularly glamorous, but it was a baptism of fire, we might say. And from there, I had the opportunity to go and work in some publishing houses up in London like VNU and also for Reed. And from there, ended up being a business development director somehow in a search marketing agency and fell in love with the agency world, really. I worked first for a small agency in the Midlands, and then after that went to work for a much bigger and better known agency called iCrossing, which has got a big global footprint, including a very significant presence in the US. So that's a bit about my background. And then one day I had the bright idea that perhaps we should start our own agency and maybe we would be able to do something differently and focus on some areas that we thought could improve the agency model. I won't talk too much about us, but that was really why we got started, and we wanted to build a meritocracy in something that we felt really proud of and that our people could be proud of. And then we had to work out a name to bring us onto that question. People often make up much better stories than the truth, I'm afraid. So people often talk to me about, were you sitting in a bar one night with a business partner? But I'm afraid that isn't true. We actually had a couple of rules, I guess, that we had for our name that we wanted to stick to. One was that we could have our name.com, no compromise. The other one is that it didn't involve the word digital or marketing, and also that obviously there were some trademark rules which we wanted to make sure that we were staying on the right side of too. And one day we came across the phonetic alphabet for inspiration, having looked and talked about many names by that point, hundreds if not thousands. And we stumbled across whiskey, of course, W in the phonetic alphabet. So we called it 3 Whiskey, as in WWW. And that is the riddle of 3 Whiskey.
Excellent.
Got it. Okay, that makes perfect sense now.
It does. I have to admit, I was intrigued. You spelling it, the American spelling of whiskey as opposed to the Scottish spelling. Is there any significance in that difference?
Yes, it's because that's the spelling in the phonetic alphabet. Okay. So being that-orientated people, we went with that.
Good to know. Okay.
The research that you conducted had to do with the role that social media plays in addressing the concerns that people have around the vaccines. And this research came out not too long after the vaccines were introduced, and they've been around for about a year now. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what the research found initially. I know that it was looking at the things like anti-vaccination sentiment online. You identified 3 groups that I think might have been a revelation back in May, but we kind of take for granted now. But why don't you run down what your original research was, what you learned?
Absolutely. As you say, we found three particular groups. The first was obviously pro-vaccination. And those people that were talking online tended to be very positive and wanting to share, I guess, that they were part of the solution, or they felt that they were part of the solution, if that's the side of the fence you choose to fall on. And they wanted to share that and the benefits of being part of the movement towards vaccination and obviously building herd immunity in that way. Then at the polar opposite end, there were the anti-vaxxers, and often those people tended to be steering towards conspiracy theories and keen to provide quite lengthy information to attempt to, in inverted commas, prove what they were saying about vaccinations, including obviously the tired stories we've now all come to know and love about being, having microchips inserted into us and Bill Gates has taken over the world, etc. Never quite got that one, but there you go. It was quite popular for a time. And then I think most importantly, and where we see the opportunity, was the group of people in the middle, the undecideds. And I have quite a lot of personal sympathy with the undecideds. I personally just immediately went out and got a vaccination because I'm a trusting person. But I do understand that there are reasons for various socioeconomic groups to have suspicions around what they're told by healthcare organisations based on history, and also really that there was just a lot of unknowns. We didn't, obviously the testing, the clinical trials were done quite quickly. From my perspective, they were done very thoroughly, but I think it was hard for people to really understand how we could have got where we got so quickly. And so there was this big group of undecideds that I think you're not going to change the mind of an anti-vaxxer, is my gut feeling. They have made up their mind and they are determined to prove to you that they're correct. So what we have to do in that situation is to provide the counter argument to the information which is being proliferated in order to help those people that are undecided to make an informed decision. And that, of course, is the role of pharmaceutical companies. And honestly, having worked with many pharmaceutical companies over quite a number of years, they genuinely do want to do that. They know that being patient-centric and providing factual information on which people can make decisions is a part of their responsibility and also part of the common good. So I think it was really a question of that. We can't worry too much about the anti-vaxxers. We can only really worry about providing information which is contrary to that they're proliferating to help people make informed decisions.
Before I let Neville ask a question, I just have to ask, because I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a few years, and when social media was just getting rolling, I got a ton of pushback from pharma about engaging in social media at all. The idea that if we introduce a conversation on this and somebody says, well, I took your drug and here's what happened, that triggers an entire incident reporting process that they wanted to avoid. Has the industry kind of come around to social media at this point?
Yes, that's really a very interesting question. And yes, as you say, the big fear is adverse event reporting, because pharmaceutical companies, once they put content of any kind out, they become responsible for the conversation around that content. They are legally responsible. And so really, there's a lot of nervousness about people starting conversations which they're not then quick enough to respond to in the way that they're obliged to. And I do understand the nervousness that they had, but as time went on, the size of the opportunity started to overshadow the level of nervousness. And one thing that we were particularly proud of, working with a very large and well-known pharmaceutical company, was actually collecting data en masse for them through social listening and actually through natural language processing, so that we could really pull together semantic themes of conversations that we're having, which created portfolios, if you want, of conversations which added up to similar topics. And then what we were able to do by doing that is to build a matrix whereby we have pre-approved responses to some of those challenges. So where there were particular challenges which were called out, then marketers immediately had a response that they were able to provide based on a framework that had been pre-agreed. And that was really important to remove some of the nervousness that pharma has, to make it truly practical for them to go out and start to share information online. Because although we understand that regulation around pharmaceutical companies it has its purpose, sometimes it actually stops them sharing useful information. And so they really wanted to find a way to meet that opportunity and to help patients to understand treatment options and have conversations with them through social media, which of course have an overall benefit for people when they're trying to tackle a health condition.
Yeah. So thinking about this, Ben, one thing that I wondered about was the kind of growth of the disinformation, misinformation that seems to be the hallmark of anti-vaxxers, which seems to me, and again, this is a lay view, I've not studied this as you would have done, but this seems to be, a year ago, this was not a good thing. It's even worse now, it seems to me, from what I can observe, what I read myself in following this, which I do. And I wonder whether some of the points you make in the blog post on the section I'm reading right now about building trust through fast and targeted responses, it talks about social proof based on the notion that when enough people say something, it's assumed to be correct. And I think that we're seeing that playing out a bit by the loud voices who are the anti-vaxxers, and the sheer weight of content, the volume of which they just pump out, that it must be hard to challenge that. And I wonder what impact that might have had, where you have a plan to respond in a timely manner to comments about social media posts when you've got this environment that seems to be getting worse day by day. How was that considered in the way in which you addressed all of this?
I think ultimately the proof is in the pudding to a certain extent, because however loud those voices have got, I refer back rather gratefully to the information that we saw back then, which is that around half of Americans stated that they were going to be happy to get vaccinated at that particular time. But actually, we're at 63.9% of people in America fully vaccinated. So somehow the message has got through that this is a much better alternative than actually remaining unvaccinated. So I think the information has got out there that this is ultimately the right way to go. It, of course, hasn't hit the levels that were hoped for. And of course, there are many European countries where the level is way higher, which is a concern. And of course, we also understand that there's a big difference between certain areas of the US. So, for example, I actually looked today that the CDC report that 79.5% of people are fully vaccinated in Vermont and 49.5% of people are vaccinated in Alabama. So that tells us some important things. One, there are local and regional differences to how people are absorbing this content or the belief systems that they have. And that talks to really part of the response to your question, which is we have the ability now to understand where to target messaging on a local basis or against audience groups in a way that manages to persuade people around particular cohorts or regions where we can have the most impact. And I feel that with the power of the data at our disposal, pharmaceutical and healthcare companies have been able to provide information, as well as organizations like the CDC and all the other people who have stood up and said, look, listen, I'm a respected peer of the community, please take this vaccine, it's for your own good. And actually that mainly, I believe that most people have enough common sense to work that out and to listen to it. And actually the statistics tell us that if 63.9% of people in the US do believe that getting vaccines is the right thing to do.
You indicated in the post on the Three Whiskey blog that social listening is the key to this, that it allows you to identify which groups are feeling doubtful about all this, the rationale behind that, what's driving that doubt, how that information is being spread through the various channels that they tap into, and that based on this information, pharmaceutical companies and other healthcare organizations can create content that makes them feel better, more confident about taking the vaccine, and allowing these organizations to focus specifically on the issues that they have, maybe regional issues, various challenges and the like. And you say that speed is really key. to doing all of this. Are the pharmaceutical companies equipped to do that kind of listening? Have you found that, at least among your clients, that they're doing it and that they are debunking these things in a very targeted way within, say, the 24 hours that people expect a response from their social media posts?
I don't know whether the responses to general themes are generated in 24 hours. I think we'd have to segment the different areas where all businesses, pharmaceutical or otherwise, need to focus their attention. So on one hand, if a consumer of any kind comes to your brand and makes a comment and says, I require an explanation of the following, or I am dissatisfied in this way, or simply, I have a question and I'd like you to help me to purchase your product or to understand what you're doing, it's absolutely key that you respond within 24 hours, because effectively it's a bit like someone calling your call center and just not being there. It just isn't good business. I think it's different when we talk about understanding the topic areas that we can collect through social listening, formulating a content strategy in order to debunk or simply educate people in ways which we can see are useful based on the questions and topics, and then disseminating that information, which I think has to be done in a timely way, but I don't think it has to be done every 24 hours. And that goes for all brands, really. I mean, all brands can learn, regardless of who they are, what the sentiment is around their business, what the common themes are about what people like and don't like, and what misconceptions there might be about their product. And they can form communication plans based on that data, which are very, very helpful in providing the messaging that they think is more accurate and or helps people through the conversion funnel, depending on what kind of organization they are. And so there are two slightly different tactics depending on what you want to do. To answer another part of your question more directly, do I believe that pharmaceutical companies are now engaged in social listening in a meaningful way in order to inform their content strategy? Yes, I do. And I think that goes for consumers and healthcare professionals. In particular, a platform called Sermo is a super useful way of collecting information about the sentiment of HCPs and the topics that they discuss. And I've seen it used multiple times in understanding and exploring conversations that are taking place around novel treatments or and other more established brands, more established molecules, and then applying information which helps HCPs in the conversations they're having to move them forward in their understanding about the options and the clinical data as an example that's available.
You mentioned debunking fakery, I guess is really what you were saying, debunking the kind of false information that Provax has put out there. I'm just curious about how you did that. Would that have been, did you engage directly, or did the pharma companies engage directly with people on social networks, or was it in a more how would you say, pointing to logical, factual, peer-reviewed content to debunk, or how did that take place?
It was definitely the latter, and pharmaceutical companies did this rather than us doing it specifically, right. But it was definitely the latter. I don't know whether you've ever made the mistake of trying to engage a conspiracy theorist online, but if you have, you will know one.
Waste of time.
Yeah, and I believe that pharmaceutical organisations understand that too. And actually, their job is not to argue with people online. Their job is to provide credible, well-resourced, well-sourced information for consumers to read and absorb so they can understand the facts. And of course, many government agencies are trying to do that as well, so that they can provide accurate information to people, which is going to debunk any of the concerns that they might have. I think it was perfectly appropriate. People should be handheld in a situation like that and made to feel safe in a situation where it was an unprecedented rollout of a worldwide vaccination that we all needed to queue up and get.
So just a quick follow-on to that. What's your thinking, Ben, on so if a pharmaceutical company conveys information or links to information that is so obviously factual and sets out facts that are hard to dispute, would it have been the case, do you think, that the kind of people who are very pro-anti-vaccine, they wouldn't be swayed by any such arguments at all? So you're not going to convert them. So would it have been then maybe an important secondary audience for that are other people who would see those messages, and maybe they might amplify them. Maybe I'm just projecting some thinking on that. So would that have been part of it?
Yes, I don't think that anybody set out to change the mind of anti-vaxxers. I think it comes down to the third cohort, the group in the middle, which is the undecided. And it was the undecideds that we really needed to give the information to. It was people who just didn't know whether they should go and get the vaccine. And one particular group was, because there was some mixed messages around it, as an example, was pregnant women. And, they may have gone and got a vaccine any other time, but they didn't really know, and there wasn't necessarily a huge amount of data. And there was also a bit of a disparity between some of the ethnic groups in terms of the level of uptake. And so companies like Johnson & Johnson, for example, actually increased clinical trials with a more diverse set of, with a more diverse cohort of people taking the vaccine or not, depending on where they were in the trial, and actually did that in order that they could be more convincing and provide more data about the fact that it did not affect different ethnic groups in a different way, and that everybody should actually be a part of that. So I think there were reactions by industry in order to gather clinical data, which they could then use to help the undecideds to make the right decision. And there was definitely evidence of that.
I have a couple questions about the tactics that have been employed. The first of these has to do with the recently released Edelman Trust Barometer, which found that scientists were, I think, the top most trusted category that they researched. Is it logical for, say, a pharmaceutical company to respond to the latest conspiracy theory with, say, the Pfizer account or the account of their chief science officer, or maybe a chemist who worked on the development of the product?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's not only about the scientists that work within their organization, but I do think that they should have those people use their voice, because I do think people trust that, and so they should. I mean, people spend, decades in academia to become scientific experts in fields, and we should believe them when they tell us things. We could talk about a whole range of different areas of current culture on that front, including, of course, the environment. But I think the other thing that they really need to do is to be partnering with scientific voices outside of their organization. So if pharmaceutical companies can stand up next to Dr. Fauci, I'm just throwing that out there as an example, and say, look, really, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here. Here's the data. We assure you that the following is accurate and true. Then actually, by those, I guess, people considered to be neutral, sharing that platform definitely adds to, to the integrity of how people receive that information.
Right. The other tactical question I had is there a difference between the various platforms insofar as the kind of information that you would share? Would you use Instagram to share different category of information than you would, say, Twitter or TikTok?
Absolutely. I think actually that people use those platforms in really different ways. Often people use Twitter, for example, as a news feed. And you tend to find that there is more news-related content that may feel more credible being shared on Twitter. That is the perception, and that's a lot of the information that we see there. Of course, there's also lots of superfluous information shared on Twitter, but it does tend to be considered more the channel where you receive that kind of information. So I would phrase, obviously you have an opportunity to share a small snippet of information, and you want to direct people into more information more deeply so that they can absorb more content through that channel. Other mediums lend themselves better to video, and I think that video is a really important and more engaging medium where a lot of people will understand and receive information much more easily. So if they can then see a voice, or maybe someone who looks like them who's in the same situation as them, that had similar concerns, and for example, somebody who they find more relatable than a scientist might be better received on a platform like Instagram or indeed TikTok or Facebook. There are definitely ways that people absorb information differently across all of the channels, and really we have to provide the information in the most appropriate way within that channel.
Well, I read a study from the World Health Organization that was published in December, talking about young people, specifically Gen Z and millennials, and how they reacted to information about COVID-19. And I just wondered, it got me thinking about what you were doing and what the pharma companies were doing. I was wondering how you might have addressed this particular audience. In other words, segmenting it by these generational divides. So the World Health Organization was quoted saying that 60% of Gen Zs and millennials they surveyed were aware of fake news surrounding COVID-19, can often spot it, but the challenge was in recruiting them to actively counter it rather than letting it slide. So many, over a third, actually just ignore all of that. So the apathy is a big issue there. Was that something that factored into the thinking about how communication was handled by the pharma companies in attracting interest from audiences like this?
I think the younger generation was certainly considered because it's a cohort where we really did have a challenge, right? The truth is that young people feel invincible, right? I mean, that's my memory of being young, however long ago that might have been. And of course didn't feel that they were directly affected by this. And so of course thinking about how to appeal to the better nature of younger generations to be part of the solution was key to the challenge. And so, we saw content, for example, that said, you need to protect others. It wasn't necessarily about, protecting yourself. If you were talking to somebody who was sort of 60 plus with a comorbidity, you could say, look, this is serious. You need this vaccination because you are in danger. But there was other content that said, be part of the solution. You may be putting others at risk. And of course, those messages are designed for different people who have a different level of perceived risk for themselves. So I think that's really important. I think getting people to be part of the solution and be the voice, be advocates, and say to their friends, look, you really ought to get this vaccination as well. I didn't necessarily see tons of evidence of that, other than, of course, the famous profile picture, which you probably see very often on your own social channels, where it says, I got my COVID-19 vaccination. And I think that's genius in a way. I mean, that's a great piece of communication at scale, isn't it? And the reason that that's created is to create, as people flick through their Facebook page and they see all these people that got their COVID-19 vaccination, with everyone they see, they build in confidence. And they may have seen people who they trust or admire and thought, oh, they got it, so maybe I should. So I think that was one of the ways they addressed it.
You've no doubt heard of Spotify.
I have.
And the controversy around Joe Rogan's podcast, which is the most listened to podcast of all. How do pharmas combat that type of promotion of misinformation?
I think that's a great question. I don't know that pharma know the answer to that. I mean, I think we should ask the Democrats, shouldn't we? That would be where we would start. I'm not sure they know either. So, I mean, I don't know if anyone's got an answer for Joe Rogan, other than to, I mean, one of the other things which is really a part of modern society is, of course, the echo chamber that we all create. And so it used to be that in the US, for example, if you watch CNN or you watch Fox News, of course, you're in this echo chamber where you're really only hearing one point of view. And of course, social media and search engines through algorithms also create an echo chamber because, of course, they provide you with information that you have liked in the past. So if you have liked information being provided by a far-right broadcaster, they're going to provide you with more information from a far-right broadcaster. And in the end, you create this kind of microcosm, if you like, where you only receive the information that I guess it's the question of confirmation bias. You create confirmation bias within the media that you're exposed to. And so, that is a challenge. And I don't think anyone's got the answer to that. I think that is a huge societal challenge, which I'm certainly not qualified to address. So how do pharma deal with Joe Rogan? I have absolutely no idea. I think they just have to keep providing the truth and hoping that common sense prevails.
I guess my final question, Ben, is what's your perception? What's your view on where will we be at the end of 2022? Do you think with this issue that is highlighted in your original post The pandemic is still with us. We still have climbing rates of infections in most countries, certainly here in Europe and in the US. I hear another dreadful statistic today mentioned the US is about to hit 1 million deaths because of COVID-19. So where will we be at the end of the year, do you think, with regard to communicating the advantages to everyone of getting vaccinated, which is at the heart of what your campaign was about? So where are we going to be at the end of 2022, do you think?
I think that's a great question. I think that as time goes on, people are going to start to understand that COVID-19 is here to stay and that COVID-19 vaccinations are going to become part of all of our lives. And I think over time, honestly, people will just learn to accept that. That's my gut feeling. I don't have any data necessarily to support that, only that other vaccinations and other things which we've become used to, like getting the flu shot or any of the other things that we all do on a regular basis, slowly become a working part of our life, and we stop debating the rights and wrongs and the whys and wherefores of them. And I think the longer time goes on, all these claims about what's going to happen to people that get vaccinations simply aren't coming true. And so over time, I think, I also think a healthy dose of COVID usually talks people into getting the vaccination. I was vaccinated at the first opportunity, and then later on still got obviously a much milder version of COVID as a result of being vaccinated. And that was definitely enough to convince me that I will be first in line for my next shot when that comes around as well. That can be a great convincer also.
My last question for you, Ben, is what didn't we ask that we should have?
I think you asked some great questions. I think one of the questions that I might have asked is, how does this apply more broadly to comms? Because I think much of what we discussed today actually applies across the piece to people wanting to build really strong communication strategies. If you're looking as a brand to build an understanding of what your customers want and build a content strategy, and a messaging matrix which is going to really address their needs, then social media, as well as other sources such as search marketing and of course talking to your customers, is a great way of building data that leads to more targeted, more useful and more customer-centric content strategy. And I think that's a great lesson for everybody. Maybe this COVID-19 conversation that we've had has led to a situation where governments and huge organizations went to market en masse with information to really help us through this situation. And maybe there's some lessons for us all as marketers about how we might apply the same logic.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Ben. It's been a terrific conversation.
Thank you. It's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.